12 hours before launch, the engineers who designed the O-rings told NASA the shuttle would be destroyed. They had data, they had charts, they had the temperature forecast for Cape Canaveral the next morning, 29 degrees Fahrenheit. And they said, "Do not fly." NASA's response was not to ground the mission. It was to ask the engineers to prove the shuttle would fail, rather than prove it was safe. That reversal, quiet, bureaucratic, spoken in a teleconference, is the real story of Challenger. This is Fail Point. Tonight's report, the Challenger O-ring decision. The space shuttle was a machine built on compromise. It had to be reusable, affordable, and capable of reaching orbit, three demands that pulled against each other from the first blueprint. The solid rocket boosters, the tall white cylinders flanking the orbiter, were not one seamless tube. They were manufactured in Utah by Morton Thiokol, then shipped by rail in segments and assembled at Cape Canaveral. That segmented design created a problem. The joints between segments had to be sealed against the most violent combustion environment in human spaceflight. The seal chosen was a rubber ring, an O-ring just like the ones inside a garden hose fitting. Except the pressures involved were nothing like a garden hose. The joint worked like this: two steel segments pressed together and a pair of rubber O-rings, one primary, one backup, sit in a groove between them. When the motor ignites, combustion gases at over 900 psi press outward, and the O-rings are supposed to seat tighter against the metal, forming a seal. The critical word is supposed to. Engineers call this process actuation. For the seal to work, the rubber must be pliable enough to respond to the gas pressure in milliseconds. Cold rubber is stiff rubber. Stiff rubber actuates slowly. And a joint that takes too long to seal is a joint that has already started to leak. That physics had been documented inside Thiokol since 1977. Roger Beaujolais was a mechanical engineer at Morton Thiokol. Quiet, methodical, the kind of engineer who kept his own files. In July 1985, 6 months before Challenger, he wrote a memo to his supervisor. The language was unusually direct for an internal document. He wrote that the O-ring erosion observed on previous flights was not a manageable anomaly. It was evidence of a catastrophic failure waiting to happen. He used the phrase, loss of the vehicle, crew, and launch pad. He asked for the joint redesign to be treated as a top priority. The memo was acknowledged. The redesign was placed in queue. Challenger flew 4 more times before anyone revisited Beaujolais' warning in a formal setting. By late January 1986, the launch had already been delayed 5 times. Weather, hardware, a jammed hatch handle. Each delay drew press coverage and quiet frustration inside NASA. The agency was under pressure, from Congress, from the public, from the White House, which had plans for President Reagan to speak with teacher Krista McAuliffe live from orbit during his State of the Union address. That pressure was never written into any launch decision document. It existed as atmosphere, the kind of pressure that doesn't appear in memos but reshapes how people read data. On the evening of January 27th, with temperatures forecast to drop below freezing overnight, Thiokol's engineers asked for an emergency teleconference with NASA. They had one chance to stop the launch. The teleconference began at 8:45 p.m. Eastern Time on January 27, 1986. Thiokol engineers in Utah connected with NASA managers at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville and at Kennedy in Florida. Beaujolais and his colleague Arnie Thompson presented their data. Every flight that had shown O-ring erosion had flown in warmer temperatures than forecast for the morning of January 28th. They argued the correlation was clear. Launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit, the coldest previous launch, and the primary seal would likely fail. NASA's Lawrence Malloy pushed back. He said the data was inconclusive. The correlation, he argued, was not statistically tight enough. He asked Thiokol to prove, definitively, that cold would cause failure. The burden of proof had just been quietly flipped. What happened next is documented in sworn testimony before the Rogers Commission. Thiokol's Vice President of Engineering, Robert Lund, was prepared to support his engineers and recommend no launch. Then NASA's George Hardy said something that witnesses remembered precisely. He said he was appalled, his word, that Thiokol was recommending against launch. and Thiacol's management vice president, Jerry Mason, turned to Lund and said, "Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat." Mason then called for a management-only vote. Engineers were excluded. Beaujolais and Thompson watched in silence as 4 managers voted to approve the launch. Lund changed his recommendation. The paperwork was signed at 11 p.m. Beaujolais went home that night, convinced he would watch Challenger explode on television the next morning. He later said so in testimony. He did not sleep. At the launch site, overnight temperatures dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees colder than any shuttle had ever launched in. Icicles formed on the launch structure. Cameras recorded them. A crew of workers spent the early morning hours with hot air blowers trying to de-ice the gantry. The O-rings, sealed inside their steel grooves since assembly, sat at temperatures engineers had never tested. Rubber at 30 degrees Fahrenheit is roughly 3 times stiffer than rubber at 75 degrees. The seals that were designed to respond in milliseconds were now barely responsive at all. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time on January 28, 1986, Challenger lifted off from Launch Complex 39B. Slow-motion film analysis conducted after the accident shows a puff of dark smoke at the right-hand solid rocket booster's aft field joint at 0.678 seconds after ignition. The primary O-ring had failed to seat. Cold stiffened, it moved too slowly. Hot combustion gases began eroding the seal. For approximately 2 seconds, aluminum oxide residue from the burning propellant actually plugged the gap and temporarily stopped the leak. The shuttle climbed normally. The crew had no indication anything was wrong. At 58,000 feet, the shuttle passed through a region of high wind shear. The temporary plug broke loose. The joint was open. At 73 seconds after launch, the right solid rocket booster's aft field joint failed completely. A plume of flame, later visible in launch photography, burned through the external tank. The liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen inside ignited. The external tank disintegrated. The orbiter was torn apart by aerodynamic forces, not by explosion in the conventional sense, but by the sudden loss of structural support at nearly 1,900 miles per hour. The crew cabin survived the initial breakup. Evidence suggests the crew remained conscious for several seconds. The cabin impacted the Atlantic Ocean at roughly 200 miles per hour, approximately 2 minutes and 45 seconds after the vehicle broke apart. All 7 crew members were killed. The Rogers Commission, appointed to investigate the accident, spent 4 months reviewing every decision made before the launch. Richard Feynman, the physicist on the commission, demonstrated the O-ring's cold temperature behavior by dipping a sample into a glass of ice water at a press conference. The commission's final report documented the teleconference in detail. It named the management-only vote. It quoted the phrase about the management hat. It concluded that NASA had developed a culture of accepting known risks as acceptable, a process the report called normalization of deviance. The O-ring had eroded on 9 previous flights. Each time it survived, the erosion was reclassified from warning to acceptable data point. Survival had been mistaken for proof of safety. Roger Beaujolais never returned to work at Morton Thiacol. He suffered post-traumatic stress and eventually became a lecturer on engineering ethics. He spent the rest of his life telling the story of the teleconference, not as a story about rubber seals, but as a story about what happens when an institution decides that the cost of delay outweighs the weight of evidence. The mechanism of failure was always understood. The O-ring was cold. The cold made it stiff. The stiff seal leaked. That chain of physics was never in dispute. What was in dispute, for one night in one phone call, was whether the people who understood that physics were allowed to act on it. They were not. Every failure has a point. Find it before it finds you.